Thanks a lot, and I do appreciate the invitation from the Open Mobile Alliance to participate in the discussions here today. I'm actually here not to talk primarily about APIs, although I'm sure the subject is going to come up, but my topic is actually leveraging smart networks for OTT partnerships. And I think one of the nice features of this conference is the way that they kind of cleverly overlaid the different topics that the speakers have so that they overlap just enough to provide some additional interest. Sorry, the keyboard doesn't seem to be responding to this here. There we go. So just a brief note on the TM Forum. The TM Forum is actually a trade association, not technically a standards organization, although it's widely known for management-oriented standards. And we are all about management. We have a large number of member companies and a large number of members among those companies. And our basic task is transformation and success through management in the digital economy. And so we started out with telecommunications, but we're in many additional verticals today. I work with the TM Forum's Open Digital program, and the function of the Open Digital program is actually in several areas. One is to develop, as it shows here, an ecosystem of open APIs. And this doesn't mean reinventing the wheel. We're working actively with other standards development organizations to identify gaps in current API coverage rather than invent yet another version of an API that already exists. The purpose of that development is to create an ecosystem that can be used equally by not only communications providers, but by enterprises of all kinds in many different verticals. And I think the API topic and the desirability of somewhat standardized APIs will return when we come back to the panel discussion, so I won't get into that particular point too much here. We are leveraging contributions from multiple angles to build the ecosystem, and the real purpose is to promote adoption and usage of APIs where it's practical. Another big focus of the Open Digital program is to integrate best practices and partnership guidelines. Right now, the whole area of business to X, as it's currently called, is wide open for development and for rethinking, and we're a big part of that. We also have an important project developing a reference architecture for digital services. This is something that's been identified as a gap by many of our members who are really putting a digital services architecture together from scratch and would like a reference architecture to work from. Some of the recent APIs that we've added to the ecosystem include catalog, ordering, ticketing, and SLA management. And we'll talk about those a little bit more when we talk about some of our hackathon and agile development experiences. So some of the topics that I'd like to briefly cover today include some of the factors that affect smart networks and OTT partnerships. You know, what's the environment that's affecting these? And you can see a list of some of those major factors there. What are some of the current approaches that have been taken to OTT partnerships? What is working in those partnerships? What's lacking and maybe what's missing? And I think we'll see some interesting angles on that. Then I'm going to turn to a bit different direction and talk about the whole bias towards agile development, a bias towards experimentation, why we need that and what that affects. And I'll look at some personal and organizational experience from some recent hackathons that we've held and from some learnings that we've had from agile processes. So I think this can be productively applied to a lot of what your organizations are doing as well. Then I'll sum up with how SDOs and trade associations can help leverage smart networks for OTT partnerships going forward. So one of the main factors affecting the ability to create and sustain OTT partnerships is the nature of changing customer expectations. And I got these from the widely publicized observation of Ray Wang at Constellation Research. If you're familiar with his work, you know that the first point there, that customers are no longer really looking for products and services, they're looking for experiences and outcomes, and that's what you're really selling them. You may think you're selling products and services, but that's not what they're looking for. They don't care about products and services, they care what they get. In his vision, experiences and outcomes are now at the bottom of the food chain. It goes way beyond that. So people are providing other items all the way up into business models, but that's kind of the basic table stakes. So going from a products and services mentality to an experiences and outcomes mentality is an important part of co-opetition with OTTs. One of the reasons that OTTs are successful is that they already know how to provide experiences and outcomes. Most of them aren't hung up on products and services. They're already in that mindset. A similar transition can be seen in the movement from B2B and B2C and all the other B to X's into peer-to-peer and machine-to-machine or mobile-to-mobile. And that's a transition that drastically affects the ability to leverage and maintain OTT partnerships because it's the very foundation on which they're built. A third one is the migration from a view of real-time information as a value being supplied into I want the information just that I need when I need it. So right time relevancy as opposed to a massive information that's overwhelming people. The nature of the networks as they're being implemented affects the way that partnerships can be implemented as well. And we're seeing this firsthand at the TM Forum as we're working hand in hand with organizations like Etsy to build out the specifications for network functions virtualization and other important areas that are overtaking the networking and IT industries. Networks are going to be almost completely virtualized. They're going to be much more autonomous than they are now. The responses of those networks and the effect of any issues or benefits in those networks is going to be much more immediate. And most importantly, the networks are going to be application aware and the applications are going to be network aware. An interesting point that I was debating with Michelle over lunch is which is aware of which? Is it the application that's aware of the network or the network that's aware of the application? And that kind of reflects the network versus IT mindset that we're seeing so much. But whichever way you look at it, it has a huge impact on partnership. There's one thing that's not going to change anytime soon, though, and that is this. The relevance, or the ratio, I should say, of people that hold credit cards to people that hold mobile subscriptions. And this is going to have immense effects for many years continuing, not only on mobile payments, but on ancillary issues like identity, trust, who you actually are going to allow to have certain kinds of information, privacy, and the baggage that goes with that. And this has a dramatic effect on who the consumer is going to relate to and how they relate to both the provider of a service and the OTT partnership that may be behind that service. So to me, this is one of the single, if not the single biggest factor that's kind of looming behind everything else, and is really kind of the landscape on which everything else is built. This is something that the financial institutions cannot overcome. Banks are becoming mobile service providers in order to overcome this exact geographic, if you will, problem. So this is an environmental effect, if you will, that is going to override almost everything else. So turning our attention to some of the current approaches to OTT partnerships, I have some examples up here. From the API perspective, you heard a presentation earlier today that was much more thorough and much more exhaustive about the different API approaches, and this isn't really intended to be exhaustive at all. This is really just looking at some of the different ways in which partnerships have been approached to date. Now, I use the word partnership loosely. You could say co-opetition, you could say kind of working at arm's length with a competitor. There's lots of different ways to look at it, but we'll just use the general term partnership in keeping with the convention of the conference. So mobile payment, there are many kinds of mobile payment, and mobile payment is probably the most overriding issue, as I pointed out in the previous slide. But there are various kinds that are being experimented. An example is the union of Verizon and its support for Google Store. Now, we'll look at this from both an advantage and a disadvantage point of view in a moment. Mobile payment is a much bigger universe than this one example. Of course, it includes things like operator billing and other ways to bill through and with the operator that don't involve a direct payment to the actual creditor. Revenue sharing is another current approach, as exemplified by Telefonica Vivo, actually the Brazil unit of Telefonica, and their promotion of Evernote Premium. So there, you can share revenues with someone, and you can take advantage of a distinctive product that people might want to use but might otherwise not use due to data service plan limitations or other subscription limitations, perhaps just the price of the subscription itself. Outright purchase is another approach. I thought I would mention it. It's not strictly partnership, but it's something that partnerships often lead to. And there are times when two companies wouldn't necessarily enter into the partnership without this kind of being in the back of mind. So a prominent example of that would be the recent purchase by Telefonica of TalkBox. Discount and the resulting differentiation that comes with us providing a discounted product or service. We have several examples of that here. Orange and Vodafone both sort of promoting Facebook, not charging people extra for using all the data that they want as long as it's going through Facebook. Reliance taking a similar approach, ironically, with WhatsApp, the application that's single-handedly destroying the entire worldwide SMS industry. And KDDI taking a similarly ironic alliance with Line. So you can see some partnerships that reflect current realities. Some of those you might say is kind of a if you can't beat them, join them approach to partnership, and not saying that it's not beneficial. However, there are some problems and potential disadvantages with current approaches to partnerships. So with mobile payment, as we said, there's a whole universe there. Mobile payment is going to be a factor in internet time, you could say forever. In the time frame that we're working with, it's going to be out there for a very long time. But we're seeing a lot of ambivalence on the part of operators, particularly with things like operator billing. I thought that it was going to be very popular, but I'm seeing a lot of operators, tier 1 operators, actually pulling back from current operator billing agreements. And I'm not seeing a lot of public discussion as to the reason behind it. I invite speculation on the panel, perhaps. I'm not really privy to the sordid details, but I find it fascinating that after setting up an operator billing agreement, which would seem to be advantageous primarily to the operator, that a tier 1 operator would actually pull out of that. Revenue sharing can be very beneficial, but can be difficult to sustain. Not using the specific Evernote example, but something theoretically like it, if you look at the competition of the entity that you're sharing revenue with, they're not always going to be on top of the game. They're not always going to be as popular. The revenue sharing agreement is going to be subject to mistrust and change on both sides, and could have some problems with longevity. So it seems to me that a revenue sharing agreement is something that's going to be useful for shorter periods of time, but it's going to be relatively dynamic. Outright purchase obviously is the most effective outcome of a partnership from the operator's point of view, but it has limited effects. Once you bring them inside, they're often lost forever. It's difficult to take a dynamic culture of an OTT, bring it inside a very large operator and sustain that culture and keep it going through multiple cycles. It's also risky because once you have it in-house, you no longer have the differentiation that brought you together in the first place. Discount and differentiation, we looked at a few examples of that. They're highly vulnerable to disruption. So even if you're relying with WhatsApp or if you're relying with Line, WhatsApp eventually is going to go public in a gigantic IPO, which may or may not be hugely successful, but that's going to drastically affect any existing alliances. So there are different ways that those discounts and differentiations can be severely disrupted. The interests of the partners in those discounts and differentiations are not going to be often in very long-term alignment. So there are problems there. But really, those are all relatively trivial compared to the bigger problems that we see today with OTT partnerships. To me, the elephant in the room is that the current methods of OTT partnership are not addressing at all the long tail of OTT providers. There are tens of thousands of organizations out there that could leverage income for operators, but it's not even possible to work with them today. And the reason, or some of the primary reasons, have to do with the partnership processes. If you look closely at the partnership processes of large operators and similar large enterprises, most people see them as being very slow to work, very heavyweight processes that were designed by legal teams over a period of years from a supplier and partner management perspective. They were not designed for the kind of dynamic, short-term, highly variable, and highly multiple relationships that are needed today for partnerships. I recently hosted a workshop at the Management World Conference in Nice, where we had some operators sitting around the room talking about some of the problems that they're trying to face in working with over-the-top players. And one of the points that kept coming up again and again was our partnership processes and our onboarding processes are not set up to take on thousands of different partners quickly and easily for short-term relationships. Because after all, if I'm going to work with a long tail, I'm not necessarily going to work with all of them at once. I'm not necessarily going to want to spend a lot of time and money bringing them on board, and I certainly don't want to guarantee a long-term existence to those contracts. I want my investment to be proportionately small and lightweight, and above all, I want the time spent on that investment to be very short. As one of the Tier 1 operators that was at the workshop commented, we really need our onboarding process for over-the-top third-party partners to be as quick, smooth, and flexible as the way that we onboard our customers. Why can't it be that fast? And why can't it be that easy? Of course, if you look inside the current processes, you can see the reasons. So to sum up, onboarding needs to be much faster, much more agile, and probably, in order to accomplish that, a lot more automated. So let's turn our attention to a little bit different topic, which we call the fail fast mindset, and which is kind of at the root of a lot of the agile processes today and a lot of the turnaround that we're seeing even among very large enterprises, vendors, and operators. And I think I didn't bother putting the guy's name here. He's got a light bulb in his hand, so I guess everybody recognizes the cranky figure of Thomas Edison. And you know, this is an interesting way to look at the outcome of what many people would call failure. And I think it's actually historically true. This is his quote, but I think it refers to the fact that he tried out like 10,000 different materials to find a proper light bulb filament. So there are different ways to looking at failure and experimentation. In that vein, the TM Forum over the last year with the Open Digital program has embarked on a radical change in the way that we look at the whole process of API development, business process development, information frameworks and business process frameworks development. And we're taking that from the standards level all the way into the API development level. One of the ways that we did that was to run a few hackathons recently just to try out some of the recently produced APIs. So here are some of the things we learned from hackathons. How to write code while eating dinner and having a beer on the side. This is actually a photograph from our first one. That wasn't what we really learned, although I think it was what a lot of the participants already knew how to do. Here are some of the things we actually learned. So developers, we figured that they were going to have a bit different perspective, but they really had a different perspective. They looked at our APIs, they looked at our documentation, which we considered much simpler than the typical API documentation and presentation, and they said, why do you call it a product API? Why do you call this a product catalog? What's a product, and why should I even care? They looked at the trouble ticketing API and said, who cares if it's about trouble? This looks like a work management system to me. And so they just went through with all these different observations, kind of taking things down to their essentials, the way that developers do, and throwing out about 90% of the carefully prepared verbiage that we had put around everything. And they, in the process, in the hackathons, they came up with some really cool inventions. The winning team built a real-time trading system on top of the catalog, ordering, and ticketing APIs. I mean, who would have come up with that? I certainly wouldn't have, because I'm embedded in this telco mindset of, I have a catalog that has a product. I'm going to order that product. That product's going to break, and I'm going to submit a trouble ticket. Well, that's great. But you get somebody in there with a completely creative and non-telco point of view, and they come up with very different ideas and concepts. And we can benefit from this, not just the forum, but all of the standards organizations and the people that use those standards. So what we've learned is that developers have a different outlook. They need very different messaging and terminology. They don't want mumbo jumbo. They don't want jargon. They have a low tolerance for anything that's excessive. They'll find very different ways to use APIs. And they're really a good litmus test for the way that APIs are presented and documented. We've made a lot of changes to the way that we present information just as a result of these initial hackathons. We've also found that different developer communities really take different handling. There is no one community of developers. Several people have come out with theories about what the different communities are, but it's very clear that there are vast differences in different developer populations. You have the Silicon Valley hackers that we recently dealt with who want to do a startup, which is great stuff, but they have a very different mentality from the enterprise developer who has a day job and they don't particularly want to spend all weekend coding, but they might want to go to a workshop and they might have different goals for learning about APIs. So there are all these different constituencies out there that need to be catered for, and that's really all part of the approach of supporting the APIs and the infrastructure that supports these OTT partnerships. We also learned a few things from running some agile processes. We found out that APIs can be developed much more quickly than we ever thought, all the way from concept to implementation. And we found out that the suppliers, the people that implement the APIs, were very enthusiastic. Within weeks of a reference implementation, we had 4 different major manufacturers implementing the APIs voluntarily with no support or encouragement. They wanted to do this. So we see some enthusiastic adoption there. The most meaningful thing to me, though, is that the short cycle time of agile development processes means that you can get input from stakeholders. And we're hearing this in a lot of the panel discussions and a lot of the presentations. The feedback loop needs to be there. We're not going to have the answer day one. Version 1 isn't going to do it all. You need to have a feedback loop for all the stakeholders to put in their learnings. So to sum up, how can we help? How can standards development organizations and trade associations help focus on OTT partnerships for smarter networks? The primary thing I think that we're all learning is focus on the current unmet requirements. Don't come in with an abstract view. Focus on what's actually needed right now. And if you say current unmet requirements, that's going to be a different list 6 months from now than it is today. That's just something that we have to deal with. It's not going to be it's going to be a moving target. Let's develop some beneficial API ecosystems and see what kind of adoption is there, see what the effect is. Is it going to turn into a federation? Is it going to be a lowest common denominator? How is that actually going to play? To that end, introduce relevant APIs, but also the associated business processes that are needed. APIs are not enough. The partnership and onboarding mess that we have today is clear evidence that an API cannot solve everything. There are certain things APIs are good for, but there's a lot more that's needed when it comes to partnership. To that end, bringing together best practices, streamlining the existing onboard processes, and streamlining is not even nearly an extreme enough word for that, for what needs to be done there. And as we mentioned, actively seeking out, bringing in ideas from multiple communities and multiple stakeholders. And of course, for SDOs and associations, that means the last item, promoting active liaison and active cooperation, which we're seeing more and more of actually in that industry. So those are the major points that I wanted to make. I think we'll have some other issues to talk about in the panel discussion, but I'll save it for that. Thank you.